Lydia had always seemed like a devoted mother, and Ethan a bright, curious 6-year-old. But beneath the calm surface of Mesa Ridge, Sheriff Dalton and Detective Rena Alvarez were about to uncover a secret that would shatter the town forever. When Marcus, the neighbor, noticed strange footprints leading into the desert, no one could have imagined the chilling discovery waiting beneath the sand. A child's body, hidden with terrifying precision, and a mother who might have orchestrated it all. Every lie, every careful step, hinted at a plan so calculated it left the investigators questioning who Lydia really was, and whether anyone in the town could be trusted. The desert stretched endlessly, under the early morning sun, a vast expanse of dry earth cracked into jagged patterns, as if the land itself had split apart in anger. The wind swept across the dunes, carrying grains of sand that stung the skin like tiny needles. It was the kind of place people drove past quickly, never stopping, because it seemed both lifeless and unforgiving. But on this particular morning, life, or rather the remnants of it, had made an ominous mark in the sand. Sheriff Dalton's phone rang sharply, breaking the quiet hum of the desert. The voice on the other end was shaky, hurried, barely coherent. Someone hiking near the old riverbed had found something. Something small, something buried. Dalton's instincts kicked in immediately. He had seen his share of accidents and disappearances, but the way the caller whispered left him uneasy. There was fear in that voice, the kind of fear that comes when someone stumbles across something they shouldn't. By the time Dalton arrived, the desert was already alive with activity. Officers had parked their trucks along the dusty path, their boots sinking into the loose soil with every step. The air smelled of dry earth and heat, but underneath it was something else, an almost metallic scent that made Dalton pause. He knelt by the disturbed sand, noticing how precisely the soil had been shifted. This was not the careless digging of a child or the accidental disturbance of an animal. This was deliberate. The shape beneath the sand was unmistakable. Dalton's heart sank as he realized what lay there. A child. The small body, partially covered by sand, looked almost peaceful, yet the scene radiated something unnatural, something forced. He could see the outline of a tiny jacket, the faint traces of shoes and the unmistakable curl of a child's hand. Nearby, footprints marred the pristine desert floor. They were recent, fresh in the sand, leading both toward and away from the body. Dalton studied them carefully. Whoever had been here had not fled in panic. No, the tracks suggested calculation, a measured pacing, as though the person had been making sure every step was carefully placed, every movement controlled. The idea that someone could have carried out such a thing, right here in a place so wide open, unsettled him more than anything he had faced in his years on the force. The discovery sent ripples through the small town of Mesa Ridge. Word traveled fast, carried by whispers in grocery stores, gas stations, and quiet streets. Ethan, the boy no one could stop thinking about, became the center of every worried conversation. Dalton knew the local residents well. They were tight-knit, protective of their own. But even in such communities, darkness could find a way to enter unnoticed. The town had its secrets, quiet ones buried beneath the surface like the sand in the desert. As Dalton waited for the forensics team, he couldn't shake the feeling that the desert itself had swallowed pieces of a story no one had told yet. There was a rhythm to the silence, a subtle weight pressing down on everything around him. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, that held its breath in anticipation. Every officer on the scene moved with careful precision, lifting shards of evidence, marking footprints, and photographing the area. Every detail mattered, and yet the enormity of the crime dwarfed the smallest clue. Dalton's mind raced, imagining scenarios, replaying moments he couldn't yet know, all while the desert sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that seemed almost to reach out toward them. The longer he stayed, the more Dalton realized that the child's story had begun long before this moment. Someone had planned this, someone who knew the desert, who knew how to use its emptiness as a shield. Dalton could feel the weight of that realization pressing against him. This was not just an accident, not just a disappearance. It was intentional, precise, and cruel. And the person responsible was still out there, moving among the town's unsuspecting residents, blending into the ordinary while the extraordinary horror of their act lay hidden in the desert. The hunt for answers had only just begun, and Dalton knew that each passing hour could make the difference between uncovering the truth or letting it vanish like footprints in the wind. Detective Rena Alvarez stepped into the dimly lit office, the scent of coffee and paper lingering in the air. The case of the child in the desert had consumed the town of Mesa Ridge, but Alvarez knew that the answers would not be easy to find. Ethan's mother, Lydia, was the first person investigators had turned to. She appeared calm on the surface, but Alvarez could sense the tension radiating from her. There was a rehearsed quality to her movements, a careful attention to how she spoke and where she looked. At first glance, she seemed cooperative, almost eager to help. But Alvarez had learned over the years that appearances were fragile things, easily manipulated. Alvarez began by reconstructing Lydia's story. According to her, Ethan had wandered off during a family trip to the outskirts of the desert. She painted the picture of a small boy chasing after a lizard, captivated by the sunlit dunes, and suddenly gone. Yet when Alvarez cross-checked details, inconsistencies began to appear. Security cameras along the route Lydia claimed to have taken showed no sign of Ethan. Even more troubling, records indicated Lydia had cancelled a previously planned outing at the last minute. It was unclear why, but her sudden change in plans raised a red flag. The detective delved deeper into Lydia's recent movements. She studied phone records, gas station receipts, and credit card activity. One piece of information made Alvarez pause. Lydia had driven alone into the desert the night before Ethan disappeared. The GPS trail left no room for error, contradicting Lydia's statement that she and Ethan had been together the entire day. Alvarez could almost see the story bending under the weight of these facts, twisting into something darker, more deliberate. She knew that if Lydia was lying, the reason would be chilling. Neighbors were interviewed, each revealing small, seemingly trivial details that, when pieced together, formed a mosaic of suspicion. Lydia had been seen pacing near the desert edge on multiple evenings, sometimes carrying what looked like a large bag or bundle. People had assumed she was merely taking evening walks to clear her mind, nothing more. But Alvarez noted the pattern. Lydia's movements were not random, they were consistent and calculated. She was familiar with the desert's quiet corners, with the trails hidden from casual eyes. It became increasingly clear that someone who knew the terrain intimately had orchestrated these movements with precision. As the investigation progressed, Alvarez began to reconstruct a timeline. The hours leading up to Ethan's disappearance were filled with strange, unexplained activity. Lydia's errands took her farther from town than anyone expected. Her stops were brief, her actions methodical, almost ritualistic. Each small step seemed insignificant in isolation, yet together they painted a portrait of careful planning. Alvarez felt a chill every time she considered the implications. A mother who should have protected her child had instead positioned herself in a way that suggested intent, foresight, and control. The town of Mesa Ridge began to stir with unease. What had seemed like an unfortunate accident now looked like something deliberate, and Lydia was at the center of it. Alvarez understood the weight of that realization. A child's life, so innocent and fragile, had been ensnared in a web spun by someone he should have trusted completely. With every new piece of evidence, the mystery deepened. How could a mother, the person meant to protect, become the architect of such a horror? Alvarez didn't have the answer yet, but she knew one thing: the truth was buried in the desert alongside Ethan, waiting to be unearthed, layer by layer, until Lydia's carefully constructed facade could no longer hold. Every step Alvarez took brought her closer to the terrifying possibility that Lydia had manipulated those around her with remarkable skill. And as the sun set over the desert that evening, casting long shadows over the dunes, Alvarez couldn't shake the feeling that the real story had only just begun, and that the full horror of Lydia's actions was yet to reveal itself. The next discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Detective Alvarez had returned to the desert early in the morning, guided by the trail of footprints that seemed almost to taunt her with their precision. The tracks led away from the burial site, winding between jagged rocks and dry riverbeds, until they ended at an abandoned shack standing alone against the endless expanse of sand. Its wood was cracked and splintered, the windows dark and opaque with dust. The structure had been there for decades, forgotten by the town and swallowed slowly by the desert. But that morning it became a focal point of Alvarez's search for answers. As she stepped cautiously toward the shack, Alvarez felt a chill despite the rising heat. There was something unsettling about the silence, the way the desert seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the floor was scattered with debris, remnants of a life long past or perhaps deliberately left behind. Among the dust and broken boards, Alvarez's eyes landed on objects that made her stomach tighten. A torn backpack, scattered toys and, most importantly, Lydia's phone. It lay in the corner, its screen cracked but still functional, as if waiting to reveal the truth. The presence of these items confirmed Alvarez's growing suspicion. Lydia had been here, and whatever had happened to Ethan was far from accidental. The phone became a key piece of the puzzle. Forensic experts extracted GPS data, revealing a path Lydia had taken repeatedly over the past month. Each route led deep into the desert, far from public roads and prying eyes. It was not the route she had described when questioned. Alvarez studied the maps carefully, noticing the precision with which Lydia had navigated the terrain. These were not the movements of a panicked parent. They were deliberate, meticulous, and chillingly calculated. Someone had used the emptiness of the desert as a shield, hiding their actions behind miles of sand and silence. The objects scattered around the shack told their own story. Small toys, once innocent, now felt sinister. Reminders of the child who had been taken. A torn backpack suggested a struggle or hurried preparation, though nothing else in the shack indicated a violent scene. It was as though Lydia had brought Ethan here, moved him with purpose, and left traces meant only for someone determined enough to follow. Alvarez could feel the tension tightening like a rope in her chest. Every detail hinted at planning, yet the reasoning behind it remained a dark mystery. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, offering no escape for the investigators yet seeming to hide secrets at every turn. Alvarez examined the footprints again, noting how they ended abruptly at the shack, almost as if the desert itself had swallowed the evidence whole. The pattern suggested repeated visits, each one building toward an unknown goal. It became increasingly clear that Lydia's actions were intentional, not spontaneous. The scale of deception was astonishing, and Alvarez felt the weight of its implications pressing on her like the desert sun overhead. As the day wore on, Alvarez pieced together a tentative timeline. Lydia's nighttime excursions, her precise movements, and the items left behind all suggested a careful orchestration. There was no room for error in this plan, and yet she had almost been invisible, hidden in plain sight. The detective's mind raced with questions. How had Lydia managed to manipulate the people around her without raising suspicion? What had driven her to such lengths? And most haunting of all, what had Ethan experienced in those final hours? By the time Alvarez returned to the town, the desert's silence seemed to follow her. She knew the shack was only a piece of the puzzle. The real story, the truth behind Lydia's actions, was still buried somewhere between the dunes, waiting to be uncovered. And with each new revelation, Alvarez realized that the investigation was only beginning to scratch the surface of a plan more calculated and more terrifying than anyone in Mesa Ridge could have imagined. The desert, empty yet alive, had hidden its secret long enough. Now the truth was slowly clawing its way out, piece by piece. Sheriff Dalton's office had become the nerve center for the investigation, its walls lined with maps, photographs, and sticky notes marking every clue the team had gathered. Despite the growing evidence against Lydia, there was still a nagging question that refused to be silenced. Why? Dalton spent hours poring over the details, trying to find a motive that made sense. Then a connection appeared that no one had expected, something that shifted the investigation in a new and chilling direction. Lydia had been involved in repeated disputes with her neighbor Marcus over property lines, and small threats that the townspeople had dismissed as trivial. At first, it seemed irrelevant, but as Dalton considered the timing of these quarrels, a dangerous possibility began to form. Could Marcus have been involved somehow? Detective Alvarez interviewed Marcus cautiously. He was cooperative, almost too cooperative, insisting he had been home the entire time. Lydia made her trips into the desert. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension building around the investigation. The timeline checks out, Dalton thought. But something about Marcus's explanations left a faint unease in the room. Still, nothing concrete tied him to Ethan's disappearance, and the focus remained on Lydia. Meanwhile, Alvarez continued to unravel Lydia's web of deception. Security footage and phone records painted a disturbing picture. Lydia had traveled into the desert repeatedly, always alone, always at odd hours. Each journey seemed calculated, a carefully orchestrated series of movements designed to avoid detection. Her explanations crumbled under scrutiny. She had claimed errands, family visits, and even exercise, yet the records told a different story. The GPS data traced her deep into unpopulated areas, where no witness could verify her presence. The detective realized the terrifying truth. Lydia had spent time alone in the desert planning her actions, every step deliberate, every moment accounted for. Evidence from the shack provided additional insight. The torn backpack and scattered toys suggested preparation. They hinted at a plan executed with precision, not impulse. Lydia had manipulated not only her son's environment but also the perceptions of everyone around her. Alvarez found herself shaken by the sheer control Lydia had exerted. How effortlessly she had constructed a reality to mislead investigators, neighbors, and even friends. Each revelation painted a portrait of a woman who could hide darkness beneath a familiar, ordinary exterior. Then, late one evening, Dalton uncovered a piece of surveillance footage that changed the investigation entirely. A security camera, near the outskirts of the desert, captured Lydia moving what appeared to be a large bundle. The timestamp placed her there well after dark, and the image, though grainy, showed a careful, deliberate motion. She carried the object with care, almost ritualistically, avoiding the open paths and sticking to hidden trails. Dalton and Alvarez watched the footage repeatedly, noting how methodical Lydia was. There was no chaos, no panic, only a meticulous execution of a plan that had remained invisible until now. The detectives began to piece together a timeline of Lydia's movements in relation to the discovery of Ethan's body. Each stop, each excursion, each secret trip into the desert was part of a calculated strategy. The realization settled over them like a heavy fog. Ethan's disappearance had not been a single moment of poor judgment or accident. It had been the result of weeks of preparation, planning, and concealment. Lydia had used the vastness of the desert as a shield, moving invisibly while the town remained unaware, blind to the danger close to home. By the end of the day, Alvarez and Dalton were left with a grim understanding. The desert had not just hidden Ethan, it had allowed Lydia to manipulate everyone around her with frightening efficiency. Marcus, though innocent, had unwittingly played a role in the illusion, further masking her actions. The case had grown more complicated, more sinister, and the detectives realized they were only beginning to understand the lengths Lydia had gone to execute her plan. The town of Mesa Ridge, once peaceful and predictable, now felt like a stage for something terrifying, with Lydia at its center and the full horror of her deception still waiting to be uncovered. The breakthrough came quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, but once it arrived, it shifted the investigation into an entirely new dimension. Detective Alvarez had been reviewing forensic reports late into the night, scrutinizing every trace of evidence collected from the desert and Lydia's home. Each item, each tiny fragment, told a story that could no longer be ignored. Soil samples taken from Lydia's boots matched precisely with the sand at the burial site. Fibers from Ethan's clothing were found in her car. These were the microscopic fingerprints of a carefully executed plan, proof that Lydia had been where she claimed she had not. Alvarez stared at the data in disbelief. Every denial, every carefully constructed lie, had begun to unravel under the weight of science. Sheriff Dalton coordinated the arrest. The operation was tense, methodical, with officers surrounding Lydia's home before announcing their presence. Lydia did not resist, but her calm demeanor was unsettling, almost eerie. It was as if she had anticipated this moment, as if part of her had known the evidence would eventually corner her. Inside the house, investigators found more than just documents and personal belongings. There were notes, cryptic sketches, and lists that suggested a mind consumed by meticulous planning. Some of the writings were nonsensical to an outsider, but Alvarez saw patterns, routes, times, and observations recorded with precision, likely detailing each excursion into the desert. The level of calculation was chilling. As officers catalogued the items, it became clear just how methodical Lydia had been. Nothing had been left chance. She had manipulated her environment, her own story, and even the perceptions of those around her to create a web that obscured the truth. The town had been fooled, neighbors and friends alike, by her ordinary appearance and seemingly normal behavior. But beneath that exterior had been a plan executed with terrifying precision, one that had put a child's life in grave danger. Alvarez felt a mixture of disbelief and horror. The betrayal was personal, not just to Ethan but to the entire community. Marcus, the neighbor who had once been a suspect, was brought in to clarify Lydia's movements further. His testimony was sobering. He had seen Lydia walking near the desert edge on multiple occasions, carrying what he had assumed was harmless. He never questioned her intentions, never imagined the horror that was unfolding. His insights helped Alvarez and Dalton understand how easily Lydia had manipulated the people closest to her, using trust as a weapon. The thought made Alvarez shiver. The calculated deception had worked so well that it took scientific proof to expose the truth. As the evidence mounted, Alvarez began piecing together a timeline of Lydia's final movements with Ethan. The moments in the desert, the stops, the hidden paths, all painted a picture of deliberate action. There was no impulse, no sudden lapse in judgment. Lydia had planned every detail, ensuring the child's disappearance could be masked by the vast emptiness of the desert. The realization was almost unbearable. The isolation of the landscape had not been incidental. It had been exploited, weaponized to conceal a crime that might otherwise have been prevented. When Lydia was formally charged, the town of Mesa Ridge was stunned. Shock, disbelief, and grief rippled through the streets. Ethan's short life had ended tragically, and the person entrusted with his care had become the architect of that tragedy. Alvarez and Dalton reflected on the case, understanding the scale of Lydia's manipulation and the danger that had lurked beneath the surface of normalcy. Mesa Ridge would never be the same. The desert, silent and expansive, had been both witness and accomplice, keeping it secret until science and perseverance forced it into the open. Lydia's arrest marked the end of one chapter, but the echoes of the crime would linger forever, a haunting reminder of how closely horror can hide behind the familiar. The trial began in the small courtroom of Mesa Ridge, a place that had never seen a case so dark, so horrifying. The air inside was heavy, thick with tension and whispered speculation. Lydia sat quietly, her expression unreadable, while the town watched, desperate to understand how someone they had trusted could commit such a monstrous act. Detective Alvarez and Sheriff Dalton watched from the back, aware that the trial would not only determine Lydia's fate but also expose the full scale of deception that had unfolded in their town. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the motives remained shrouded in darkness, leaving everyone in the courtroom with a gnawing sense of unease. As the prosecution presented the case, every detail of Lydia's planning came to light. The forensic evidence, the GPS data, the soil traces, and the hidden shack all formed a chilling mosaic of calculated intent. Witnesses described her movements, her strange behaviors, the ways she had misled friends and neighbors alike. Each revelation deepened the horror. Lydia had spent weeks orchestrating her plan, ensuring no one could trace her actions until it was too late. The courtroom felt suffocating as the community grappled with the reality that a mother, someone meant to nurture and protect, had become the architect of a child's suffering and death. But the trial held one final shocking twist. During cross-examination, Alvarez revealed the notes and sketches found in Lydia's home. At first they seemed random, almost incoherent. But Alvarez's meticulous analysis uncovered something sinister, a plan that went beyond the desert and beyond Ethan's disappearance. Lydia had been tracking other families, noting their routines and vulnerabilities. The implication was horrifying. Ethan was not an isolated target. The pattern suggested she had considered harming other children, and only the intervention of the investigators had prevented further tragedy. The revelation sent a ripple of fear through the courtroom and the town beyond. Mesa Ridge had narrowly avoided an even larger catastrophe. Throughout the proceedings, Lydia remained eerily composed. Her calmness, once mistaken for cooperation, now revealed a deeper, unsettling control. She had manipulated appearances, concealed her intentions, and maintained her composure even as the weight of the evidence became undeniable. It was clear that she had lived in two worlds simultaneously, one visible to her neighbors, friendly and ordinary, and one hidden, calculated and dangerous. Alvarez felt a shiver every time she considered the duality, realizing that the ordinary can hide the extraordinary and the horrifying. When the verdict was finally read, Lydia was convicted on all charges. The courtroom erupted with a mixture of relief and grief. She would never have the chance to harm another child, but the town had already felt the consequences of her actions. Sheriff Dalton and Alvarez walked out together, their steps heavy with the weight of the investigation. They reflected on the lessons the case had taught them. Appearances can be deceiving, trust can be weaponized, and evil often hides in the most familiar places. In the days that followed, the desert returned to its quiet state, as if nothing had happened. Yet those who knew the story could not look at it the same way. Every dune, every shadow seemed to carry the memory of Ethan, of Lydia's calculated cruelty, and of the secrets the sands had once held. Mesa Ridge slowly tried to heal, but the silence of the desert remained, a constant reminder of the darkness that had been lurking just beyond sight. Alvarez often returned to the site, standing among the dunes, reflecting on how fragile innocence can be, and how easily the ordinary can hide the unimaginable. The story of Lydia and Ethan became a haunting lesson for the town. Some secrets are buried for a time, but eventually the truth will rise, unearthing horrors that can never be forgotten.